Hello, I'm Brent Mitchell with the final presentation on the IUCN guidelines for privately protected areas. Previous presentations summarized the 8 sections of best practices. We learned about establishing privately protected areas and that they are distinguished by private governance, but must first be a protected area, fully meeting the IUCN definition. From Sue Stolten, we learned that much about managing PPAs is similar to other types of protected areas, and that other IUCN guidance and tools to achieve effective conservation apply equally to PPAs. Tracy Cumming described some of the incentives for PPAs, and Juan Bizauri-Creel talked about ensuring permanence, ideally in perpetuity. There are many subtypes of PPAs, and Nigel Dudley walked through issues specific to individual ownership, for-profit companies, not-for-profit organizations, religious entities, and educational institutions. PPAs should be coordinated with national protected area systems comprised of other types, though James Fitzsimons reminds us that that can only be with landowners' consent. Heather Bingham described steps being taken to get more PPAs recorded in the World Database on Protected Areas, again with consent, and made clear the distinctions between PPAs and OECMs under private governance. And looking out from individual sites, Pedro Solano related some of the important roles of PPA networks at national, regional, and international scale. Throughout, we learned that governance is not the same thing as ownership. In talking about protected area governance, we are concerned with who is making the most important decisions about management, which may not equate to land tenure. Thus, PPAs can exist even where private land ownership does not. As we said at the outset, the guidelines are just that, guidance. The world is too complex for one volume to provide a detailed how-to manual to fit every social, political, and economic context. But the guidance is based on broad experience from early beginnings to the present. Now we turn our attention to the future of PPAs. Going forward, what can we expect from private governance approaches to address our many conservation challenges? At the global level, attention to the governance of protected areas is a relatively recent phenomenon. Until about 2 decades ago, it was broadly assumed that protected areas are the responsibility of governments. This thinking persists in many parts of the world, despite the fact, which you may recall from the first presentation, that the first private land trusts are as old as the first national parks. Private stewardship of natural resources goes back much further. But as appreciation of different types of protected areas grows and recognition of the benefits of such governance diversity increases, the potential for success in biodiversity conservation expands as well. We can expect that as global goals for area-based conservation rise higher and higher, that the contribution of PPAs will increase as well. Biological diversity underpins ecosystem functioning and the provision of ecosystem services essential for human well-being. Governance diversity in protected areas underpins our systems of in situ conservation of biodiversity. Protected areas of different types have different strengths and challenges that influence their effectiveness in the long-term conservation of nature. For example, generally, government protected areas are not susceptible to changes in ownership, whereas PPAs may be. On the other hand, being private, PPAs can be less vulnerable to political change than their government counterparts. Thus, a diversity of governance types lends resilience to any protected area system. PPAs also contribute to good citizenship. As a private voluntary action, Establishing and managing a PPA is a way for individuals to participate in conservation. That is true whether the person acts as an individual or family landholder, as a member of an NGO, a director, executive, or even employee of a company with a PPA. From large wilderness areas to tiny plots of private land harboring endangered species, PPAs provide an avenue for very direct engagement of people from many walks of life. IUCN has adopted the term privately protected areas to help express the reality that PPAs have many public benefits, despite the fact that they are established and managed by private entities. These benefits include in situ biodiversity conservation, habitat conservation, restoration and connectivity, ecosystem functions such as water supply, geoheritage, providing for research, religious attachments, personal fulfillment, and often public access. PPAs often provide public benefits at a lower cost than public agencies, managing protected areas directly. Managed by private means, PPAs reduce public costs to purchase and manage land and water resources by governments and hence taxpayers. Countries can maximize these benefits by encouraging and supporting PPAs. Now that said, I have a caveat about public costs that I will return to in a moment. As with all protected areas, there remain many challenges in ensuring PPAs fulfilled their full promise and the ideals set down by IUCN in its guidance for protected areas. Our 2014 report, The Futures of Privately Protected Areas, highlighted these challenges and included 8 overarching recommendations to further develop PPAs. Many of the recommendations of the 2014 Futures Report remain valid and unfinished. We've worked very hard to establish the definition, which I think is some of the most important work IUCN does. Some countries have PPA systems, but most do not. Monitoring and management effectiveness evaluation are really in their infancy. National PPA associations exist in some regions more than others. We've produced the first guidelines on PPAs, but there will be need to improve on them over time. Incentives need a very great deal of attention. And as you've heard, we're making progress on reporting of PPAs thanks to the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. These recommendations are further elaborated in the IUCN resolution supporting PPAs from 2016. Societies are confronting existential environmental crises in climate change and biodiversity collapse. Now add to that public health and the threat of future pandemics. PPAs, alongside other types of protected and conserved areas, offer enduring natural solutions. The task at hand now is to make sure that PPAs are reflected in the post-2020 framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this must dovetail with the decisions to avert climate catastrophe and the next global health emergency, as these will drive the agenda going forward as much or more than the CBD. And as part of the solution to all three, scientists and activists increasingly call for expanding the area set aside or otherwise affecting conservation. So how do we get there? First, let's look at the goal conceptually. I'll talk about 3 elements of area-based conservation: intent, effectiveness, and governance. Protected areas must have a conservation intent by definition and should, but do not always, have effective conservation. Other effective area-based conservation measures must have effective conservation, but do not have a primary conservation intent. We are learning that in most instances, effective conservation correlates positively with good governance. Protected areas and OECMs may or may not have good governance at present, but most of the planet has neither effective conservation nor intent to conserve. In a desired state, more of the other areas contribute to conservation. Protected areas still must have a conservation intent, and they also demonstrate effective conservation and good governance. OECMs must have effective conservation, and they demonstrate good governance. By definition, OECMs do not exhibit intent. If they do, they become effective protected areas. But importantly, more of these other areas become OECMs or protected areas. And that's what the targets are all about. I should also say that ideally, areas always move to a higher degree of protection or effectiveness and not go in reverse. Also, there are often stepping stones of protection or conservation as an area achieves a higher state of conservation or durability as will and financial resources allow. As the total area in conservation grows, the great challenge will be documenting and demonstrating that they are truly effective and communicating that to the public and policymakers. Conservation requires commitment and investment. One thing we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, when tourism and other revenues supporting protected area management dropped off, is that we cannot expect managers of nature conservation areas to generate all their own income. That is true for privately protected areas as well as government and other types. We must recognize that we have a debt to nature, and to restore balance with nature, we have to repay some of that debt. That means public investment in protected areas of all kinds. While our specialist group is focused on elevating the recognition, understanding, and integrity of private conservation, that should not imply that we think PPAs are somehow better than other types, or even that protected areas are always preferred over OECMs. Context matters. We're looking for the best solution in any given situation. And at landscape scale, we think in terms of mosaics of governance. Here again, diversity is important, as important to governance, just as it is in biological systems. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. It is not simply a matter of choosing one governance type over another. But for greatest protection, we should be thinking of layering governance structures over each other, so that if one fails, another level might not. This might look like shared governance, such as First Nations being on equal footing in management decisions for some huge units of Parks Canada, or NGOs effectively running protected areas on behalf of the government of Belize. We don't know how large the role of PPAs will grow in coming years, but without privately protected areas, we're missing a piece of the puzzle. A puzzle of putting nature back together that we must complete. And finally, restoring balance in nature globally will be the work of generations. We who are in the fight must attend to our own self-care, restore ourselves, and spend as much time as we can in the nature we try so hard to protect. Thank you.